This clip from the SVLG Cities Matter Summit is brought to you by Google.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Teresa Alvarado. I'll be your moderator this morning. I am so excited for this panel and to talk with these panelists about equity and infrastructure right now in particular, because this is a pivotal moment for our country as far as infrastructure. And it's important that we not only understand and reckon with the inequitable infrastructure investments, policies, and operations of the past, but that we get this right because infrastructure investments are big dollars. And what we build today shapes communities and will impact our lives for generations. As we heard earlier in the talk with Secretary Buttigieg and Mayor Liccardo, the American Jobs Act is looking at something on the order of $2.25 trillion over a decade, investing in a broad array of infrastructure that will touch each and every one of us. It includes $20 billion aimed at redressing historical inequities, which the White House describes as a way to advance racial equity by connecting communities historically isolated by infrastructure decisions and fund environmental justice. So let's hear from this terrific panel about how we approach this scale of opportunity with equitable recovery at the forefront. Let me start with you, Therese, and ask you to set the framework for how to think about how to build equity into an infrastructure program that is so big and potentially transformative.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and it's a pleasure to be on this great panel. One of the things I believe you heard from Secretary Buttigieg is that this is really about stimulating the economy. But the economy is made up of lots of different layers, and too often without an intentional policy and program, our most vulnerable communities can be left behind. So I've got 3 observations of how an infrastructure program could be designed and delivered to ensure that equity is really at its core. And the first starts with this notion of community-driven choice. It's incredibly important that an infrastructure investment program be flexible enough to allow bicycle and pedestrian level investments in communities, as well as the big mega projects that everyone loves to ribbon cut with, whether they're, multi-million dollar, high-speed rail projects or, major highway investments or the like. And one of the other things that's very important is to think about an infrastructure program that allows for the operations and maintenance of the infrastructure, not just the building of the infrastructure, because really to sustain its value, you need to incorporate that as well. Another really important thing is equitable access to the innovation and the delivery of what a project could be. So there's a very incredible focus in my mind on, for example, climate change and tackling that with things like pushing forward electric vehicles and the infrastructure attached to that. But very often with new innovation, that can often be shuttled to the more privileged or well-to-do elements of our community, and then others lag behind. And we need to ensure that this innovation is available at the front end for anyone who would want to use it. In addition, and I believe other speakers will pick this up, the delivery of the program can bring its own benefits. So workforce development that's attached to community members being able to be part of the delivery of the program is critical. The last thing I'll say is that we need to coordinate these infrastructure investments across sectoral silos. So we need to think about transportation investment and how that coordinates with housing investment, how that coordinates with resiliency related investment. Because if they're not all working together in a community, we're going to lose a lot of the inherent benefit that's there. And that's going to be a challenge for the federal government to set up a program whereby the departments are working together across what I've often said, the cylinders of excellence that we're so used to being attached to. So those are 3 thoughts.
I like that, cylinders of excellence. Senator Wiener, you heard Therese talk about flexibility and coordinated investment across silos. I know that here in California, Governor Newsom has released a water resilience portfolio that challenges our state government to work in a more integrated fashion to prepare for the many challenges we're already seeing due to climate change. Can you share your perspective on infrastructure investments that achieve multiple benefits for all people and our environment in California?
Great, and thank you for having me. And it's great to be here with my friend, Teresa McMillan. As a former MTC commissioner, congratulations on your work. Yeah, I think we tend to view in infrastructure context and otherwise, we view often and make decisions about these critical issues in silos separately. And, you know, housing, and I have the honor of chairing the Senate Housing Committee, housing is excuse me, one of those areas that it intersects with like everything, like absolutely everything. When we have bad housing policy and aren't creating enough housing and aren't investing enough in housing for low income people, we completely excuse me, undermine economic growth. We undermine economic mobility. We undermine public transportation because if we have a lot of sprawl and spread out housing and don't focus our housing and have those densities, it's hard to have effective public transportation. When you have a lot of sprawl and spread out housing because you don't have zoning for density where the jobs and transit are, you have to build a lot more sprawling I'm sorry, my voice is a little weird, a lot more sprawling water and power infrastructure. Which is very, very expensive to have that kind of sprawling power and water infrastructure. It creates wildfire issues and so forth. And of course, housing and transit investments need to be paired. I think a lot of times what we've seen, and Teresa certainly has seen this probably a million times, there's a push in communities that they want all of this money because they want to build a train or they want to have all this, beautiful transit infrastructure, but they don't want to build dense housing around it. My view is that we should never, ever, 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 ever be making big transit investments in areas unless first they do a major rezoning to actually allow for a ton more housing around it. Because we've seen that over and over again. BART stations that are in purely single family home communities, Caltrain stations, the smart train. And so then people have to either don't use it at the level they should, or they have to drive to it, and you have to have massive amounts of parking. So all of these issues and these infrastructure investments intersect. And that's why I love that the Biden plan, it's not big enough on the housing piece, but it's starting to try to provide financial incentives for states to stop cities from blocking housing.
Thank you. And we'll talk about Plan Bay Area in a little bit as well. But Walter, as a small business owner and advocate, how can we make sure this enormous national investment helps those who have been harmed or ignored by infrastructure historically and who've been so terribly impacted by COVID?
First off, let me say good morning, Teresa. Good to see you. Senator Wiener, Therese, great to be here with all of you. And I'd like to thank the Silicon Valley Leadership Group for making this opportunity available. Well, first of all, let's just say this, that the idea that we're going to have great jobs and union jobs is wonderful. I think that, this is an opportunity to really get America back to work. But that does not necessarily mean that the minority and women owned businesses are going to have the opportunity to participate in this process. And I think it's very important, and I would say this to the senator and others who are helping to really formulate what the final details are, is that minority, women, LGBTQ, disabled vets, and others must be included in this process as a way of building our communities from the inside out. I think Teresa's right when she talks about community-driven choice of what types of investments must be made. You have to have community involvement from beginning to the end to make sure that these communities are fully represented. The investment distribution effort must be community-driven. And I'll point out that many of these small women, minority, LGBTQ, and other businesses have had a very tough time during COVID. They've had a tough time before COVID, but after COVID, many of these businesses during this process have gone away and will never come back again. But you know, one of the big things that's happened too is that many of them have had a tough time accessing COVID funds. And so this is not anything new, because access to funding has been a major problem for minority women-owned businesses and others. And so I think that it's very important that we use this as an opportunity for those businesses that are hanging on by a thread to revitalize these businesses and these communities from within, and use this as an opportunity to get new life into their operations. This is America's opportunity to revitalize communities that are historically forgotten and left behind. From the poor of East San Jose to the Appalachian Mountains, the Biden plan does not discriminate. It is inclusive of every American in need. We must make serious investments in infrastructure broadly to recognize that minority women, small-owned businesses are from communities that have been hardest hit and from a disadvantaged position to begin with. This is key for every type of infrastructure investment, from transportation, housing, clean energy to broadband. Furthermore, these investments must be made not as a one-off, but in a way that creates ongoing, long-term, sustainable investments in communities who need it most. The Biden plan is a generational opportunity to address poverty and to begin to assist minority families and children in fulfilling the American dream. I would like to just say, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, independents, blacks, whites, let's not waste this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and let's work together to get it right.
Thank you. And of course, you know, it's not just what infrastructure we invest in or how we invest in it, but how we use the infrastructure we have. For decades, we've been trying to reduce solo driving rates so that we can make a dent in greenhouse gas emissions. Today, the transportation sector still accounts for over 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And we know air pollution disproportionately affects low-income communities and communities of color. So Therese, in MTC's Plan Bay Area 2050, you're taking a broad and I think a bold approach to solutions to the solo driving and the greenhouse gas problems. Can you talk a little bit about why this approach is so broad and how you're building equity into your solutions?
Certainly, and for our listeners, Plan Bay Area 2050 is the region's 30-year long-range plan. And, you know, to the point that Senator Wiener was, you know, highlighting, it probably does the best job of any plan we've had to intersect transportation, housing, the environment, and the economy, and all of the intersections that need to work together. And with greenhouse gas reduction, I think I would not be speaking out of turn to say we are chasing the curve on this. There is so much ground that needs to be made up in terms of dealing with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the long-range plan really needed a plethora of strategies to anticipate meeting the state delivered target that we had, which was really substantial in terms of reduction. We needed more transit. We need more bike and ped. We need more telecommuting. We need to price our roads. We need to really invest, again, in electric vehicle technology. But the core to all of that is asking, what are the impacts of doing all of those strategies? The positive impacts: does everyone have access to these alternatives to solo driving? Can they afford it? Is it available in their communities? What's the timing in terms of putting this new infrastructure in? And then we have to ask the question, where are the negative impacts? You know, with road pricing, that's a great thing unless you're a low-income driver who perhaps can't absorb into their income what a priced road would entail. So we're constantly going to have to ask the question from an equity lens. With all of these strategies that are needed, how are they available to everyone? And are there negative impacts that we need to think about, as Walter said, at the front end, and design the strategy to deal with those and not wait till something bad happens and try to mitigate it later?
Great, thank you. Senator Wiener, do you want to talk about our land use planning?
Sure. So, I think when we talk about climate in particular, everyone in concept says, oh my God, we're in a climate emergency. We have to take bold, aggressive, immediate steps to try to move the dial in reducing carbon emissions and not exceeding the 1.5 degrees Celsius, or et cetera, et cetera. And everyone's mad that we withdrew from the Paris Accord and happy that we went back in, and that's all great. But then when it comes to the tangible steps to do that, it's constant pushback, whether it's telling the cement industry you need to clean up your act, or whether it is saying we should extract less oil and gas, and then there's immediate pushback to that, but from vested interests, or we need to have more housing density near where the jobs are, near where the transit is, so that people are driving less, or driving shorter commutes, or not driving at all. And then you get the immediate pushback. So people who, they claim they believe in climate change, but then when you say, okay, you live, 3 blocks from a BART station, we want to put apartment buildings in your neighborhood, all of a sudden they become climate deniers effectively by having all sorts of excuses for why there shouldn't be more people living. They should have their own personal BART station, basically. So it's really, helping people connect the dots about the personal choices, not just the personal choices, but the policy choices that we make, the impacts that those have on climate change, impacts that they have on air quality, including in the Central Valley, not just in the Bay Area, and helping people understand that when you fight X, Y, or Z policy, you are fueling climate change and connecting our own personal decisions, not just in our own lives, but how we work in the community to those goals in terms of climate and equity. Because we are, when you look at the air quality in Central Valley, how much of that is because we have pushed so many people out of the Bay Area into the Central Valley, and you have all that commuting happening, and it's just people need to really focus on the big picture here in terms of this emergency.
Thank you. Let's talk about how we operate our existing infrastructure. An excellent study out of LA called How Women Travel spoke to gender equity issues in transit in Southern California. More frequent service is more equitable for women who bear the brunt of the household errands and child rearing, for food service workers, custodians, and many other essential workers who rely on transit. COVID has shown us that even if transit ridership isn't high enough to make money off fares, as a society, we still need to get these workers to their jobs. So how can we do better when planning transit service that meets the needs of everyone in our community, given the continuous strain on operating revenues? Therese?
Oh boy. The story of transit and what people want to see in terms of more service, more routes, more frequency is always dealing with the struggle of getting the operating assistance to make that happen. In terms of our, national, state, and in some cases, local funding policies, it's always been easier to get money to build transit, to build that rail extension, to buy new buses, et cetera. But to actually run them is a constant battle. And one of the things, of course, we've seen, with COVID is an extraordinary stepping up of the federal government in terms of first the CARES Act and then the CRISA, the second wave COVID funding, and then of course the American Rescue Plan under the Biden-Harris administration that brought extraordinary amounts of operating to the table. But those are one-time gifts. What we need is a sustained level of additional operating assistance in order to really deliver the types of the level of service that we need throughout the day, and to break away from the classic, we're going to concentrate on the commute and then, I don't know, sort of figure out what to do everywhere else. And in that score, there's one other thing to think about, which is the technology aspect of it. We need to think about public mobility to deal with the needs that you described. So a 40-foot bus may not be the best way to serve someone who needs to travel and doesn't have a car at 9 p.m. at night when they get off a shift at the hospital, right? So we need to start also thinking about what is the best technology we have, and maybe think about public mobility as opposed to public transportation in the traditional way we've thought, and be more creative about how to bring all of that to the public interest and the needs of those who need it most.
Thank you. Walter, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, we will need to build and operate a system that does more than just cater to white collar commuters, that's for sure. Mapping and tracking a bus service, make information available to folks waiting so that the service is respecting of their time and their needs. Furthermore, non-commute hour transportation can cater to the needs of the local communities, running chores, going to banks, doctor's appointments, and other tasks that require public transportation. Not everybody can afford Uber. And so this alternative, or it's funny to call public transportation alternative, but in communities of concern for poor and disadvantaged people, that's the only way they'll be able to travel. And again, Therese is dead on. We need to rethink and reimagine how public transportation looks and functions, and particularly from the investment standpoint. It should be an investment, and as much as possible, it has to be subsidized. It has to be subsidized by public dollars, because it truly is not a profit center, if you will. And it should be about service and service to people. Maybe we can learn from the past, and as we look to try to reimagine the future. Years ago in San Francisco, where I grew up, between bus lines, that they had shorter, faster trips. They had these little vans called jitneys. And it's interesting that they no longer exist, but they served a key purpose because they were a little bit cheaper than regular bus service, and they ran between bus lines. And they also ran during off hours when there wasn't a lot of buses available, and they served the purpose for individuals, mothers, and who were running chores in local neighborhoods to get to and from the grocery store and back home, and so on and so forth. And they were small vans, and they served a great service in the community. So yeah, Teresa, she is dead on about this. So, I think we need to also, we need to speak to these communities and find out, listen to them and find out what it is that they need as we tackle these transportation challenges. I think that, as experts and individuals who are activists, we tend to think that we know what's best for these communities. And I think when we talk to them, sometimes we find out that they have needs that are different than what we may think. And then there are, what I call, these, in Silicon Valley anyway, in the Bay Area, these white and black buses. I like to call them Darth Vader buses, because they look like Darth Vader. They carry some symbol of evil, according to some people. But they travel along our public streets in Silicon Valley, supplanting public transportation. And the current laws prevent public transportation agencies from even competing in this arena, sapping millions of dollars from the public coffers. This must be addressed. Silicon Valley high-tech companies, they don't want to be in the business of running bus services. And so, transportation agencies should be allowed to do what they do. I think we need to take a look, Senator Wiener, at these laws that prevent our public transportation agencies from competing, and allow them to compete in these areas as an alternative to bring back dollars to the public coffers. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Senator?
Yeah, on that point, with the tech shuttles or the employer shuttles, it's not only tech. I think one of the reasons that they exist is because we have not done nearly enough to actually make it easy for people to regionally get around on transit. So, for example, if someone's living in San Francisco and working in Cupertino, how do you get there? You have to take like 1 to 2 buses to get the Caltrain. You take Caltrain, then I guess you take another 1 to 2 buses. Like, no one is going to do that unless you literally have no other option in life. And so people are either going to, are going to drive if they can. And so, these employers have filled in the gap with saying we're going to have more direct and reliable bus service. You don't have to make like 3 or 4 connections every day, twice a day. Like no one is going to do that unless you have no other option. And so I feel like because of our truly inadequate network, these employers have filled in the gaps with all the pros and cons that come with that. And I think what I will say in terms of what we need to do, first of all, in this country, we have so underinvested in buses. It's really shameful. I'm a big fan of rail and subways and high-speed rail, all that. That's really important, but not at the expense of buses. And I feel like buses get just relegated, and that's where poor people ride. Well, first of all, great. We want everyone to ride. One of the great things of Muni in San Francisco is just a mix of people on buses, which is not often the case in other parts of even the Bay Area, let alone the rest of the country. But buses it's so cost effective. If you give them like transit priority and facilitate it, it can be fast. I know, like, I haven't been to London in a while because of this pandemic, but when I've been there, there are times when it's faster to take the bus than it is to take the tube, because they really prioritize buses, and they have congestion pricing and bus only lanes. And so it's super, super fast and efficient, and it's cheaper to build. And so we really need to bulk up buses in this country. And the final thing I'll say is with transit funding, it's great that we've gotten all this federal money. We need to stop letting transit agencies think it's a good thing and brag about their high fare box recovery, that, 70% or 80% of our revenue is from fares. We can look at BART or Caltrain or other. That is a bad thing. When a transit agency is 70, 80% fares, that is a bad thing, because that means we're not putting enough taxpayer dollars into stabilizing that agency. It means that fares are going to be too high, which they are on BART and Caltrain. And it means that they are going to have an incentive to focus on the highest volume lines, because that's where the revenue is coming from. So we've got to get more stable operating taxpayer dollars in and stop forcing them to rely so heavily on fares.
Thank you, Senator. So we only have a few more minutes as a final question. The national awakening we're having about equity can take many forms, but a core principle that I've heard from many of you this morning is about centering the voices and needs of the most vulnerable in our decision-making. And what's interesting is in the Biden infrastructure plan, there is much more proposed than traditional hard infrastructure, such as digital housing, like Opportunity Housing proposal in San Jose, nature-based solutions, environmental justice, and social infrastructure like childcare. All of that requires a culture change. We're very comfortable talking about, miles of pipes and concrete. So how can we build awareness and change policy, investments, and services to be more inclusive and change our processes to ensure inclusion and equity? Let's start with you, Senator.
I think it's about making sure everyone is at the table, because traditionally we made decisions without always the most impacted communities at the table. And when you look at, for example, an environmental movement, which traditionally for many years was dominated by large nonprofits that were led and often very dominated by white, really upper middle class, upper income people. And recently we've seen the emergence of the environmental justice community in terms of advocating for frontline communities of color. So, and that's a great thing. So it's about making sure we're empowering and listening to the most impacted communities.
Thank you. Therese?
Well, I know that we're, running short on time, so I will just reiterate the key message that I think all of us are touching on. We need to involve and have authentically, I guess, at the table those who have been the most harmed, and respect that their views of what that harm has done to their communities may not be the perspective that we have. And we need to ensure that they are importantly not only defining the problem, but also the range of solutions, and can create them with us. And there are challenges. We often can't do even what, communities want at any point in time, but we can try to be able to make sure that their voices are at the front end of solving these otherwise intractable issues.
Thank you. Bring it home for us, Walter.
Okay, listen, guys, this is interesting. Every time there's been major investments made in communities of color, poor and disadvantaged people, those communities have been, people that live there have been displaced. These investments must be made in these communities to keep these people in place, not just today or tomorrow, but for the next 500 years. These investments must build rooted communities or corporate investments and complement the existing communities and institutions and maintain the culture that currently exists and to augment it so that people won't have to be displaced so they can enjoy the investments that are being made in these communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.